Okay. All righty. And I going to try to do something with this topic of evolution and sex. And, hopefully, if there's enough time with the questions, we can dive into the real details of anything that's on your mind from the point of view of human sexuality to universal sexuality. So, I've just put this in the context of a very, very, very broad overview of evolution and sex specifically, and that's where the none other comes in from the perspective of theosophical thinking and the occult side of thought. And for myself, I make a difference between occult thinking versus one that would be a practical occultist, because we're all invited to think occultly about matters, which differs then conceptually, but not necessarily are we invited to be practical occultists. So this comes from the perspective of primarily the occult thought that HPB provided from the secret doctrine. The use of theosophy in general as just a little prelude uh, can be done in several different ways. And these bullets don't capture all of those ways. But we can study theosophy primarily as a philosophical doctrine, and perhaps that's what many do. It's interesting, it's got fundamental principles, you can work with those, and then you can put the books down, you can put the thoughts down, and you can go on and do what you would regularly do during the day. And it's interesting. Or we can begin to study that philosophically, but also accept the premises and the principles that it provides and begin to investigate our world inwardly and outwardly, or the outer world environmentally, or to the degree that we can, that cosmic world astronomically, and see if these same premises and principles apply, if they hold, if they're true, or if they have some resonance of truth. That should be determined by one's own investigation, by one's own self investigation. Then we can take it a step further. Once we begin to understand, as we'll see perhaps tonight, that there are certain patterns that reverberate throughout the entire philosophy, we can begin to see them as tools. And when we see them as tools, we can apply them and use them to open things, tighten things, modify things in ways typically that we would not if we were just stuck in sensory-based conceptual thinking. And that's very interesting. It opens up many, many different points of views and worlds, such as some that we'll see tonight. But at the same time, it places one kind of in a liminal zone, such that if we're not careful, we can begin to misrepresent what is relatively real for what has no basis in reality at all, thereby getting fused and kind of losing our stability. And as a shrink, we often see that kind of thinking very, very often, and it's more pronounced in us as a general public than we think. But then if we really work with those tools and we see them reproduced, then we can look at them as representing laws in nature. That takes us to a deeper level, because now we're doing the scientific thing, using those laws to understand phenomena subjectively and objectively in ways that we typically don't. And this clearly, in many ways, takes us outside of the realm of daily thinking in terms of going to work, coming home, going shopping, taking care of the kids, and everything else. And so it does something to the headset that some people are not necessarily comfortable with. But at the same time, if that is sustained, then it takes us to the next point where we can begin using them to transform not only our very perceptions, conceptions, and being, but the environment around us to the degree that it is acceptable to the influences that we begin to utilize on a daily basis because they have now become part of our life. And this is important because, in a sense, when we're going through some of the things that we go through tonight with the SD as it relates to evolution and sex, they've got to be experienced and they've got to be perceived in some meaningful way that is reliable, such that it's not just happening once, but it's reproducible. And that's the system behind the teachings, that it has been checked, it has been reviewed, and it is reproducible, not only in terms of using it as a tool, but in terms of the effects that can be generated from it. So everything that we're about to look at pertains to these different levels of viewing theosophical thought. Some of the terms that would help us understand this object, i.e., evolution and sex, are included in these bullet points. The three fundamentals are, typically the basis, and one of my favorites, because in my world, there is nothing that is devoid of these. And as we'll see, as we try to unfold this thought, the very essence of the three fundamentals is the very basis of both that evolution and sex, as we begin to work from universals to particulars. We will try to see that sex is inherent in the very fabric of substance. And that is reflected in that symbol of the yin yang that was used for the image of this talk. In that center, there is a point, then there are the two sides, then within each of those sides, there is the opposite. And yet they are all contained within the circumference of that circle. And the swirly lines represent the motion and the breath that is always going on. And so in one symbol, we unfold, as we'll see, the particular paradigms that reflect all of the sexuality that could ever be expressed in any particular form, the reason why it is there to express those forms, and the ground and source from which it comes. The term sistas is a term that HPB uses as the seed manus in some respects, as those immortal beings that set the keynote for the entire starting of this evolutionary cycle for us as a Mahamanvantara, and what that means in terms of development, and what that development reveals in terms of the sexuality, both on a horizontal as well as on a vertical and a XYZ axis in-depth subjective perspective, as we understand it from the perspective of polarities, of complementarity, and of the ins and outs, the subjectives, the objectives, not only the males and the females, but any other opposite that exist in that world of duality. Obviously, we have to understand the principles, the planes, the rounds, the races, and the stages of transformation that these go through in order to appreciate the vastness of that evolutionary expression that we take for granted when we talk about the great breath, or when we talk about pralaya and manvantaras. We can say them very easily, but the information and the science that is packed into those two words is more than what has ever been expressed in the SD, which is why HPB said she could only select a few of those stanzas. The terms Agneshwatas, the Luna Pitris, the Ahi, the Manasa, all are related intimately to our being as human evolutionary souls. The different fires that are used in the creative process as we're going through rounds and races and correlating those with the terrestrial developments and the polarities and the forces and the sexes again become very important. The idea of links is one that, as we're going through SD2, looking in more detail at some of these thoughts, she uses infrequently but importantly, because in a sense, she's telling us that there are certain lines of evolution that exist in parallel fashion. You might call them parallel universes, but at a certain point in time, they begin to link up. And part of that linkage is then what allows one to influence the other and vice versa. Prior to that, it's as though the two were existing independently of each other. Hence, she says, the missing links and things of that nature we will miss unless we know how to shift gears. But the classical, typical way of looking at things is only from the point of view of when that linkage occurs, which allows for the connection between the two planes. And so she tells us in those works, as it relates to this grand process of evolution, there are links between the terrestrial and the astral. There are links, as we know, between the kama manasic mind and the astral in its higher sense, if we use it in that way. There are links between the manasic plane and the atma-buddhic nature or planes. And so all of these links have their own timetables, so to speak, i.e., cycles of overlapping interactions that allow for the communication of one principle with another to generate an integrated entity of sorts on whatever plane. Sex, we have to understand how we're using the term. You know, it's simple enough to talk about it as, you know, excuse my bluntness, sexual intercourse, but that misses the point. The point is that sexuality has been generated in nature as a means for reproduction. So we can look at it strictly from a biological perspective, but even deeper than that, we're looking at it from the perspective of how the one becomes the many, how the many then interact to create the diverse, and how that diverse is always moving towards the greatest expression through complexity that it can in terms of monastic awakening, spiritual awakening, and assuming the totality of what we can be at any particular time. Then we have to keep in mind the actual global changes that occur that she speaks about that are not independent of, quote, the monads, but still the terrestrial evolution with its change of skins may be the one thing that goes on parallel with the astral evolution until those linkages occur. And there is a continuity and flow between those that allows for a further degree of evolution. And that couldn't occur without the polarity that one attracts to the other. And so now we're talking about polarities and forces, another type of sexuality that is reflected in the poles of the earth, the north and the south, that's reflected in the magnetic fields, that's reflected in the dynamics between the solar influences as well as the lunar influences and how they come to impact the global development. All of those aspects of sexuality, difference, polarity, or opposition are spoken about in degrees in this. And then the other piece that we have to remember and is intimate to all of this is that the monads, we use the term monad in a very general sense, but there's specificity to the monads. There's specificity to the degree to which they have expressed developmental awakening. And I use that term expressed because HPB tells us the monad in and of itself, whatever it is not the thing that's evolving. Forms evolve, forms transform, the monad unfolds. And so that's giving us a different internal picture of the monad in relation to the vehicles that it uses. And those vehicles, she tells us when we're looking at the entire evolutionary process, as she has explained it to us in the SD, pertains to the globe, which is one aspect of that. And the monads that are being utilized as the lunapitris are perhaps another. Those that are affiliated with the solar pitris or the Agnishwatas, or those that are related to The monastic awakening are another class. And so she gives us the differences in terms of class, and she gives us the differences in terms of stages of expression, i.e., those that are related to the lower four physical planes, those that are related to the monastic planes, and those that are related to what she calls the monadic or the divine planes. And so all of this we have to keep in mind and mix, yet appreciate almost in individual streams dancing together that present the appearance of the complexity that we see in the world, in the universe, as it relates to all of the forms, keeping in mind the monad that's within it and the process that it's going through. And so when we get to the general topic of evolution, the simple questions are, what is it? Evolution of what? What is it that's evolving? What does that even mean? From what? Where does the evolutionary process begin? By what means? How does it unfold? For what purpose? If there's a beginning, there's got to be an end, and hopefully the end is meaningful in relationship to the beginning because they're polars as well. And in the end, we usually have gained something that we didn't have from the beginning. And so that's another type of opposition. That's another type of sexual unfolding and development, or love. And we can speak about the prototype of love as eros, as she says, that which is always seeking to bring together those principles of the universe for a greater expression, not of the absoluteness, but of the one. And so there's another polarity and another inherent sexuality that we'll be looking at perhaps. Then for what purpose, to what end, for how long, and then what? And I just put reassimilation in that prolaic condition because in a sense, from what is where we're beginning, and yet where we end up is back in that condition. So we've got to understand what that difference is from the beginning to the end, since it appears that we're going back to the same place. And so these are just simple thoughts that we are expressing as we move along, because again, I think really the details get flushed out in the questions. So when we look at evolution, we can look at evolution as a process, and it's going from one point of something that is typically nothing to a point of something that is typically a great degree of expression that evidences change and awakening, whatever that change and awakening is, and perhaps a greater realization. And so that evolutionary process has to do with something pure coming into manifestation and reaching a point wherein somehow it wakes up to a degree of self-reflection. And from that point of self-reflection takes on another level of karmic experience. And I say another level because in the letters, the teachers tell us that even the animals have their karma, even the globes have their karma. And so there are different levels of karma that we're talking about because all of these are composed of monadic beings. And yet we typically never consider those in relationship to that full evolutionary process, nor do we consider karma in relationship to sexuality, sexual development, sexual choices, which we'll be looking at least in general, in a little bit. And so when we're talking about evolution, what is that goal? And this is one of the, at least for myself, favorite quotes that HPB gives us in the SD, volume 1, page 183. Every form on earth, every speck, atom in space, strives in its efforts towards self-formation to follow the model placed for it in the heavenly man. It's the atom's involution and evolution, its external and internal growth and development have all one and the same object, man. And we have to understand it's definitely not us as man that this is referring to, but man as the highest physical and ultimate form on this earth. And here's the catch, the monad, in its absolute totality, an awakened condition as the culmination of the divine incarnations on earth. That is evolution for a particular cycle in a nutshell. From the atomic and what we would call particle level of quantum physics, and even prior to that, because in the SD, there are indications that she makes references to prior states, as we can see from the stanzas, up through all of these states, following the image of the, what she reflects here as the heavenly man, but as we see on different levels as the fullness of the divine thought in its total potentiality, currently now expressed and actualized through the activities of that monadic essence, in conjunction with its force, acting as consciousness in the world for the benefit of all of life in that particular cycle. And so once we have that, we can say, again, evolutionary development of what? We're talking about, when we really hone down to that, the monad. And she gives us several definitions of what that monad might be in the SD. And putting aside the metaphysics, I just like to look at the monad as the three fundamental propositions. She tells us that the monad expresses the monadic essence, that there is a force that is eternal within the monad itself. And within the monad itself is the image of that heavenly man, if we use those kind of gross terms. And so what that means is that the very monad, as the evolutionary potential of all things, because remember, the monad, she tells us in the stanzas, can apply to the universe, the multiverse, or to an atom. And so it's the monad at different degrees of unfolding in regards to a full self-reflective awareness of what it's unfolding, for what reason, according to law, because that law, as one of those three fundamentals, is inherent within the very monadic essence itself. And it is the force that follows that law unmistakably that we call karmic expression. And it is the same essence with force that allows us to aggregate around ourselves, as she tells us later on in the process of the rounds and races, the forms that are reflective of the degree of awakening and unfolding of that particular monad. And so the monad becomes the reality if we can only understand how it communicates. And so its inside connects us to what we might call, expressed in the Bhagavad Gita, Brahma, without that little a arister on top of the a. I forget the exact term for that indicator. But it rests as Brahma, the exhaustless, the boundless. And Adhyatma is resting on that. That is the prototype of the zero, the boundless, and the Adhyatmic point, or the one. And so if we think of it just in terms of computer science, we've got a zero and we've got a one, and that is the ultimate language for computers that can be used to generate any conception or represent more properly any conception that we can conceive, as well as any mathematical formula that we need to work in order to produce any real outcome that we need to do. And the two, in and of themselves, the ocean and the point, are their own polarities, their own inherent sexualities, because they have to interact. And the way the monad interacts with the absoluteness is hinted at and indicated in the ST. And yet that then becomes the true fractal, if you will, the true prototype for that duality that interacts in such a way to produce something that we call that third piece of the triangle or the puzzle. We can go on throughout the various levels of universal manifestation, and we can see the eternal type, that's simply what I'm calling it from that perspective, manifesting itself as deity and law, putting those two together, creating that product or child evolution. We can see it as harmony or symmetry, those centripetal and centripetal forces coming together to create the harmony on the manifested side. And she uses those terms in the SD, or the product, or the child, or the son. So again, we're talking on universal levels, as above, so below. The echo and reverberating manifestation of the pure type of unity generating the androgynous, which then generates the polar, which then becomes the dual, which then becomes duality. And this is the progression, as we'll see later on, that she gives us. But we can see again, if we look down just at this third bullet, the absolute, Parabrahm, and Mula Prakriti, a triad in and of themselves, yet in this case, Parabrahm becomes the opposite of Mula Prakriti because it's the dynamic that is necessary to manifest the Mayic universe. And this absolute, when we look at the earlier pages of the ST, she defines as the absoluteness that gives rise to Parabrahm and Mula Prakriti. We've seen it in the monad, the force, and the essence that she uses when she's talking about more mundane things. We've seen it in the archetypal image, in the divine thought, the logoic reflection, and the planetary spiritual vibration that sets off the entire course of manifestation. Different things that must interact in certain ways in order to manifest a product that becomes manifest. Sexuality inherent within the various levels and dynamics of the universe, which then echoes just as the divine thought reflects itself in the logos, which reflects itself in the Dion Chohans, which reflects itself in the spiritual egos, which reflects itself within the rays. And then finally, in our limited intelligence here on Earth, there's a constant reverberation of those dualities, of those potential sexualities, of those contrasts, of those complementary pieces, of those opposites, just echoing, echoing, echoing throughout the tremendous expanse of all manifestation. She goes on to tell us that these go further, bare subjectivity, expressing itself as pre-cosmic ideation and substance. These two having to interact in order to manifest manifested universal substance. Brahma, Viraj, and Virat. Brahma, the Dion Chohans, and Fohat. Again, different flexible applications of the forces, of the intelligences that come together to create the products that we come to familiarize ourselves with on the metaphysical side, coming down to even Manu, giving rise to the races of humanities, manifesting as personalities. All of these from a center of relative unity to a dichotomy to an interactive relationship of sorts that produces products that are manifestable and have their own agenda as it relates to the evolutionary awakening or the return from the involutionary descent to the evolutionary ascent, from the, as we'll see, descent of the Agnishwatas as the solar or positive intelligences, and the Lunapitris as the recessive, the passive, the receptive forms. All polarities inherent within the very processes of nature, whether we're looking macro or micro, it doesn't matter. It's all there. Even our breath, the inhalation and the exhalation, are reflective of these different polarities. Our blood going through the process of oxygenation and then deoxygenation, polarizing the different sides of our body, depending upon where those veins and vessels and arteries are. So everything, again, reflects a sexuality that is much more broader and much more wider than we think of when it comes down to just male and female reproductive organs, or how those male and female tendencies within human form and mind reflect the thinking. And we'll try to get to some of that as it relates to just the everyday. But once we realize that it is this eternal pilgrim or monad that is going through that evolutionarily awakening process, and that it is impersonal and exhaustless, i.e., truly immortal. And it has the ability to what HPB calls assimilate. Then we can position ourselves mentally to realize the greatness that lies sleeping like the sleeping beauty within the very nature of our souls. And we can realize the real possibility of waking that up. Not thinking that we have to be special to do that, but understanding that as being inherent within the very reality that we are. And that reality is beyond life and death. And when we tune into that, we are then able to understand that sexual dynamic as it relates to the planes and the transitions and the fluctuations in consciousness in their polar fashion, as well as in their manifest opposite fashions, coming down to what we call today the female brain and the male brain, or the female body and the male body, or the female hormones and the male hormones. Words, 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 names, 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 but underneath all of that is one eternal type, one eternal process reverberating throughout nature in many, many different ways, independent of time, space, or possibilities that are limited simply by the way we think, as opposed to reality. And so when we say, what is evolution? That process whereby beginning from that particulate, unconscious, impersonal, non-experienced monad, if we can use those terms loosely, to the fully awakened, embracing that totality, having unfolded it, realized it, and actualized it as the evolutionary process, then that what that is going through that process is not the races and not the forms and not the personalities, but the monad. And so we've already answered, in a sense, our next question: from what? To what? The from is, as all things arise, from that absoluteness. And we typically talk about it as being non-conceptual and beyond the limitations of the human brain, and that is true. But HPB also tells us in loose words that it is not beyond the spiritual perception of that great awakened spiritual sense. And so, like the watcher, we can balance ourselves precariously in two realities on that threshold, appreciating the absoluteness in all its fearful awesomeness that is just consuming, and yet looking into the world of the bound circumference with all of its diversities, all of its processes, positive and negative, subjective and objective, beginning and ending, homogeneous, heterogeneous, diverse, differentiated, complex. All of the expressions of that monadic essence in time and space, driven by that exhaustless force that is inherent unconsciously, as she tells us, in the monad, page 110 or so of SD2, that pushes it on in terms of evolution in conjunction with, in that case, the astral forms that give us our personality, but in all cases, through the forms that it is working in order to gain experience that awakens its own inherent potential in awareness. So always we are moving from homogeneity to diversity and complexity. And then, as the teachers tell us, resolving that complexity through assimilation back to homogeneity with the awareness fully in hand of the experiences of that complexity, such that when we become workers with humanity, we know who, what, where, when, how to operate on those different planes, within those different cycles, within those different degrees of substance. Because remember, on each plane, we come down, we hit that equilibrium point where there is a semblance of consciousness that is reflected eventually on the fourth plane, but on each plane, it's somewhat different. And coming down, it becomes more covered by its own essence, becoming more coarse. And finally, we awaken to physical intelligence. And then we resolve that physical intelligence on the way back up, but not losing the wisdom nor the awareness. And then we impact that within our nature, and then we go the second round. And all of that brings us to the point of true evolution, not only throughout a global system, but throughout a solar system, and then throughout a galactic system, and then throughout a galactic cluster system, which is nothing more than the multiple organs within one body performing different functions, thereby having different degrees of intelligence for the various performances of function that are required of them. And then integrating that back into that Brahmanic consciousness, which is the totality of those 7 Dion Chohans, as weird as that thought is, in terms of that evolutionary potential. And so we see from the homogeneous to the hetero, to the diverse, and then resolving it all back up to the homogeneous for that particular cycle, all of the knowledge that is gained if we are not jeopardizing the lives through an aberration of our incarnating manasic or kama manasic entity. And so we can go through all of these planes, all of these stages, and we can see the conditions and from what point we arise to what point we attain the same point from which we arose, but not in the same manner, nor in the same state. Then we can ask, how does this occur? And the Pythagorean triangle is a great reflection of the processes that we've just been talking about. And there's the 1, then there's the 2, then there's the 3, then there's the 4, and the total of the 10. And HPB summarizes this in different ways. And most of you are familiar with the proem, and she gives us the circle and the point and the diameter and then the cross. And really, when we're looking at this, we can say from the boundless to the bound. And she says that circle appears on the boundlessness, which is no different than Adhyatma appearing in the Gita on Brahma, the exhaustless. And then within that bound, we get the point. And that point has its natural circumference or its natural radius and diameter for its evolutionary period. But that radius and diameter then create that duality. And it creates the polar forces, or the centripetal and the centrifugal, or the spiritual and the material, or the akashic and the astral, or the, again, we can go through those Parabrahm, Mulapakriti, the Dhyan Chohans and Fohat, the divine thought in the divine bosom, the spiritual ego and the spiritual ray, the Manu responsible for the global awakening of a particular round or race, or however we want to divide that entity up, as it represents the consciousness potential for that humanity, down to the humanity and the personalities that partake of that. And so everywhere we're seeing this reflection, then from the two again to the three, as she shows us even in terms of the logos, one giving rise to two, the two giving rise to three, the three existing as the germ within the triangle, which then is reflected in the four. And that triangle then is reflected downwardly in one point, and we've got a diamond. And what is above then gets reflected in what is below. And that four, she tells us, unfolds into, or the four actually becomes the cube, which unfolds into that seven. So from 4 to 6 to 7, and we know that unfolding is due to the Makaras, the Kumaras, the Vajras, all of those manasic intelligences of various grades and degrees that use those forms. And so we've got the 1, the 2, the 3, the 4, the 5, the 6, the 7, and then the 8, she tells us, is a reflection of the 4, the Tetractus, which is the highest 4. And that can include the absoluteness and the absolute in Parabrahm and Mulapakriti, or depending upon how we're moving that downward, even higher levels of increasing metaphysics, yet lower than that absoluteness. And then that reflects itself in the lower in terms of the Tetragrammaton. And those lower forces, as they're generating the manifestation of the universe, the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, the manifestations. And then the 9, which is the summary of the 3, and those 3 can be the Atma Buddhi Manas, they can be the 3 gunas, any which way you want to look at it. They can be the 3 logi, they can be the Parabrahm, the Mulapakriti, and Brahma. Depending on how you're using these as tools will determine what you come up with in terms of understanding that you then double check with the teachings. And then that totality is the 10. And that 10 we know is reflected in the perfection of that particular hierarchy, where she tells us that the kingdoms from the 3 elementals to the mineral, to the vegetable, the animal, and the human, and then the additional 3 that introduce the being to another higher level of evolutionary development. And so everywhere we're seeing the reflection, the echo of these types, of these patterns, of these different degrees of polarity, of sexuality, of interaction that are necessary to bring about productions that are required for lower levels of involvement in matter and form for the experience of the monad. And so when we get down to the globe, now we're talking about what some may be more familiar about, i.e. the races, the rounds, the globe. And the global development is related to, but not dependent, in a sense, on the monads at the different stages. And HPB tells us the globe goes through its own 7 rounds, 7 changes, changes its skin, etc. And yet the Luna Patrice, are those that were brought over from the Shistas, or those perfected beings, or what she defines as those Dion Chohans that have sacrificed themselves for the continuity of a particular race of humanity and its principles in the future Manvantara. And she says, the best of us that have run the evolutionary course will become those in that Agnishwata fashion, or that Kumatic fashion, and be there to light up the minds of the lower Lunapitris who have also been brought over as seeds. Again, seed Manu and root Manu. They've been brought over as the seeds that will sprout the Lunapitri evolutionary energies and forces, as well as intelligences in conjunction with the elementals and the globes and the elements, to build up form that can then be used by those monastic beings to waken the Lunapitris that had reached near to that human stage, but had not become human in their ability as it relates to consciousness, self-reflective awakening. And so it's a very intricate process, but she tells us in a nutshell, those monads in that fourth bullet, they're the most developed, and they go through all of those courses within the first round and are ready to enter that human stage. In other words, they are ready to be lit up. Then there are those that are the average bunch, and that average bunch is still a range of differences in terms of the Lunapitri monads that can reach the human stage. And she says those usually occur between rounds 2, 3, and the end of 3, and that early 4 to mid 4. And then there are those that just can't catch the bus. They are not less, but the timelines for development are such that they will not reach that human stage in this Manvantara. And yet, those that do and complete that Agnishwata cycle will again be available to awaken them at the next great cycle. So there is a continuity there. And that continuity has to do with the great polarity. That great polarity as reflected in the solar Agnishwata, i.e. the sun force, life, prana, positive, hot, and the lunar, cool, mild, receptive, reflective. And those must meet through that karmic link. And so not only is there an astral terrestrial link that is necessary to bring those two planes into union, there is a karma manasic link. As the teachers tell us, if karma as a karmic principle were not developed to such a degree that it could receive the manasic ray as well as connect with that lower astral, then this linkage could not occur. That ability occurs in that fourth round. And then when we get to that fourth round, we run into this situation, and this reflects this quote. Again, underneath the quote on that monadic unfolding is this one: the Dhyanis, the Pitris, are those who have evolved their bhuta, doubles from themselves, which rupa, only form, has become the vehicle of monads, 6th and 7th. These are a different class of monads that had completed their cycle of transmigration in the 3 preceding Kalpasa rounds. Then they, the astral doubles, become the men of the first human race of the round, i.e. the man form, the human form. But they were not complete and were senseless. And that's as good as they get. That is the highest peak of that lower evolutionary development that makes them ripe for that karmic force to cement the monastic light with the lower form. And then she goes on to tell us that these beings were those pure immortals from Shista Dhyanis, self-born. not born through birth as we understand it, self-born. And there is, I don't like the word mystery, but there is a scientific truth embedded in the understanding of that monad that allows it to be autogenous and self-born. And she says these self-borns then become the first race on the new planet. And this is a short summary of that process. The first race then merges into the second by becoming what it exudes from itself, a different kind of sweatborn. So whatever exudates, whatever gels, and she describes this differently as she's talking about these races that are exuded from the pores of these lunar beings as the lunar pitris become the covering. And so the first race, as she says, never dies. It simply becomes absorbed in the second. And then the second goes through processes analogous to fission. And if we look at cell division, that's the analogies that she was referring to. Polar extrusion, where the spindles are dividing, the DNA divides, comes into a cross. And we're familiar with those two triangles, downward pointing and upward pointing, and how they can move. And when they hit that center, it's that six-pointed star with that dot, which is that seven-pointed circle, a different level of understanding and application of symbology related to the same process that we're talking about. If you want to call it from a sexual perspective, the forces pulling each other, drawn to each other irresistibly in terms of presenting and producing a product that was not in existence before as such. And she says these give rise to, again, the polar extrusions, and they go through that process called budding. Some of these then fall off and become what she calls descriptively spores. Some of these spores then aggregate and they begin to build up different levels of, for lack of a better word, and this is not correct, molecular aggregation to create organs. And then these become ovid as they are aggregating all together, and that ovidness becomes shell-like or egg-like. And then the egg beings are formed and they are nourished by the sun and moon, both literally and metaphorically. And that then tells you, as she says, about the stages of the globe and the forces of the sun and the forces of the moon in their dynamic polar interaction, sexual, if you will, as it then takes its place in the very egg form of the budding form of the new race. And then that third is what is called the egg-born. And within that egg-born, we get the repetition once again of one thing turning into an androgynous state. And in my mind, I make a slight distinction between hermaphroditic and androgynous. Androgynous contains the seeds of both, but they are not necessarily formed. The hermaphroditic contains the sexual organs of both, whether it be plant, whether it be reptile, whether it be so-called human beings. And then that hermaphroditic separates. And we get true male, female races or developments. And she tells us that because of the nature of the sexual development as it relates to the polarity within the hermaphrodite and within the androgynous states, there are things that can kind of go karmically wrong. And they may impact the very forms that are available. And then there are animals that were also developing during those times that can impact the developing eggs. And that can cause additional mishaps in form and expression, as well as capability. And then to make matters worse, when the sons of wisdom were supposed to incarnate, and again, I just pulled these out because they speak directly to the point. And let me just see how much time I've got. Okay. How did the sons of wisdom act? And we can probably just read this. We can choose, said the lords. We have wisdom. Some entered the chaya, some projected a spark, some deferred till the fourth. From their own rupa, they filled the kama. And again, this is the karma principle that's necessary to link the lower with the higher only as it relates to the mind. But without it, that linkage cannot be cemented. Those who entered became arhats. Those who received but a spark remained destitute of knowledge. The spark burnt low. The third remained mindless. And we know what the teachings say about the mindless mating with the animals of the time that had not had their sexual boundaries completely separated based on species. And so there are aberrations in the formations of the forms that developed, and she talks about how that relates to the apes, etc. And then she tells us there were those that rejected the self-born. They are not ready. She recapitulates. They rejected the self-born. They are not ready. They spurned the sweat-born. They are not quite ready. They would not enter the first egg-born. And those were, again, that range of androgynous to hermaphroditic to clear separation, because she tells us each race goes through 7 distinct changes in sexual reproductive capacity as it relates to manifesting the lies. And then when the sweat-born produced the egg-born, the twofold and the mighty, the powerful with bones, 18 million years ago, the lords of wisdom said, now shall we create. The third race became the Vahan of the lords of wisdom. It created sons of will and yoga. By Kritya Sakti, it created them, the holy fathers, ancestors of the Arhats. And this takes us into a whole nother branch of variations in terms of spiritual consciousness and awakening versus development of form, as it all relates to the monads using those forms at the different stages of development within the human category of formal expression. And so, again, why? Because we're working towards that original quote that was mentioned in the beginning. The absolute totality and awakened condition as the culmination of the divine incarnations on earth, based on the knowledge and the wisdom that has been assimilated into that monad, as well as self-reflective consciousness that now allows it to become something greater than what we consider to be typically sensory object-based humanity. And so when we have these pieces of the puzzle, we can begin to look at what sexuality is. And I know I've only got a few more minutes, but within just our space and time. I mean, if you think about it, we've been around here roughly 18 million years, the teachings say. The Earth is 4 billion plus, and the universe is older than that. So when it comes to sexual reproduction, in the grand scope of evolutionary development, how much of a time period does it take up? And we know that we're at the lower end on the ascending for this round, and that will also change in its expression. So we make a great to-do about it, but it's not really that big in the grand scheme of the totality of what our capacities are as awakened monads. And so when we're bringing it down to our day-to-day level, we can realize basically from a biological perspective, sex is about reproduction. It's about reproduction of the species. And yet we know that with inappropriate use, there's a lot of disease that can go along with that can impact the species. Then we can talk about sex and its relationship to love. Sex is not love, but we usually associate the two. And so we usually talk about love as being expressed through sexual gratification. But the teachings tell us that sexual interaction was truly understood for the sacred act that it was in the early beginnings. And so that whole act was ritualized. And it was ritualized to reproduce the original beginnings as it relates to Eros, the absolute, and the manifestation. And so it wasn't just a aha, feel good moment. It was a whole way of life living and understanding. And some of the earlier tantras, if we speak about them in their higher sense, were simply reflections of those mysteries that were embedded in the process that would sanctify an act instead of allowing it to be used in an animal or bestial fashion just to gratify sensual feelings and emotions. Different than expressing what we consider to be the highest love through union. And so we can talk about then gender and sexuality. Gender being that internal sense of what we feel we are versus the external sense of what the body says biologically we are. And so therein we can have conflict. I'm a female on the inside, but I'm expressing myself as a male on the outside. Then we can have sexuality as it relates to, I feel like a man on the inside, but sometimes I want to dress up as a woman. Sometimes I want to dress up as an androgynous figure. And sometimes I want to do a little bit of both, or sometimes nothing. I want to be neuter. And all of these in that field of psychiatry we encounter. And it's not so much a judgment call as it is an understanding call. And when we try to understand it from the point of view of a theosophical evolutionary development, we've got real serious questions to ask ourselves. Are these beings that are caught up in bodies that are related to earlier periods of evolutionary development? Are these monads that have karmic linkage with that, neither good nor bad, but are just linked there? Are these beings that are on the evolutionary track and have far surpassed the normal limitations that we attach to sexuality and are trying to express that inner union that is beyond sexuality? And so they feel like they don't need to identify as a sexuality. And so when we're looking at all of these individuals going through these phases, because that's what HPB says we go through, phases, the attempt is with a clear mind to try to understand what the need of the soul is, what the brain is going through, whether or not there is congruence, whether or not there is conflict. And then sometimes we can find individuals that are, as we say here, sexually addicted. And again, no different. We have to understand that from a karmic soul perspective, not from a judgment perspective. And then there are beings that, for one reason or another, that are tied into aberrant acts of sex, some with animals, some with objects. And they don't know why, they're just driven. And it's almost like an obsession or a possession. And so the thing is, how do we deal with that? How do we make sense of that? How do we work with that? What do we do for them that is in their best interest, as opposed to interfering negatively with the karma that's unfolding in a certain way and making it worse? And so I'm going to wrap that up here, because again, when we look at the beginnings, universals to particulars, and the absolute, as the teachings say, and I think it was one of the teachers of HPB says, occultism does not recognize sexuality as such. And that's a paraphrase, meaning that true occultism is above sexuality, as we understand it conventionally, although the misuse of sexuality can have negative karmic impact upon us as beings. Thank you.
It's interesting that you reduced sex to a 1 and a 0. So you really
and further to the 0.
You've gotten into a very detached, that Eros has to do with numbers. But I am curious, though, in a serious note, how does the Eros or Fohat arise out of the 0 and the 1? You probably explained it, but I just wondered if you could, what your thoughts were.
How does the really what you're asking is, how does the one arise from the absolute?
Well, I wouldn't, no, I didn't want to get that abstract.
Well,
Because-
and the reason why I say that is because without the boundaries of the second one, as HPB talks about it, as the reflection or as the sweat born of the absolute, depending upon what terminology you want to use at that level. Without those limitations, you can't really talk about Foha as such. Just like she says that although force is inherent within the absolute, you can't really talk about force without talking about it in relation to Mula Prakriti. And Mula Prakriti then is the reflection of that absolute as part of Brahm that has its own limitations. And within those limits is where the possibility of Maya arises. Within those limits, within that germ, within that triangle of that third logos, as she tells us in the SD and in the transactions, without those limitations, you can't then talk about the stirring up of how the breath, which is ceaseless, now becomes contained to create a force. And so, we can joke, but at the same time, if we look at what she's given us in the SD and the Blavatsky Lodge, Foha becomes an expression after that third logoic expression. Before that, it's something else. And that something else she talks about as the light of Devi Prakriti with its properties that then manifests through that third logos as Foha in conjunction with the Dian Chans, or the Fohatic force, because she makes a distinction between the adjective use of what is Fohatic in life versus Foha as an entity that is involved in the building up of manifested cosmos. So, I mean, I do joke, but the 0 and the 1, but again, without that first one, we have a very difficult time talking about the manifestation. And so that's why she says the first one as the absolute, we can't say anything about, but that second one as the beginning, we can attribute very many things to, and Fohat would be one of those. She expresses that in another way. There is the eternal understanding of the universe. There is the pre-cosmic understanding of the universe. I stick in the genesis of the universe, and then there is the post-manifestational aspect of the universe. And she tells us that most begin at stage 3 in terms of expressions. And that's where perhaps we would be looking at that Fohatic force related to the Dian Chohans as a constructive force in the building up of the universe.
I just want to say bravo. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank HPB and her teachers. Thank you. Yes, Judy was, I see Judy hand.
Monica's next.
Oh, okay, Monica's?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're
Yes.
audible.
Thank you so much, Jean. This was just magnificent. But here is my question, and it's regarding the LGBTQ community.
Mhm.
I'd like to know, because they are so maligned and misunderstood, specifically because of sexuality. If in your work, it's one thing that you carry the vibration and the goodwill of theosophy, but do you use these ideas directly in your work with them? And if you do, how does a person who doesn't, who may have a tremendous amount of confusion, do you think that it would be healthy to introduce some of these ideas that you spoke about with the reasons for these different types of sexuality? to a person who may not know what's driving them?
Okay, so I guess the simplified version of that, would I introduce theosophy to someone in that community or any other sexual community that appears to be different than the norm?
Yes.
And the short answer is not theosophy in terms of words, but theosophical thought in terms of ideas. And really, it is not what I think they need, but through that, I guess, old Socratic method, understanding to the best of my ability what that soul is asking for.
Okay.
And once I can have an understanding of that, we can dance, we can talk, and the issues will surface, because the issues are then generally manifesting themselves as anxiety, as conflict within themselves, as depression, questions about suicidality, dealing with their impulses, sometimes being aligned with their impulses, sometimes being in conflict with their impulses. And then sometimes feeling like a different sex inside versus the sex that they're expressing outside, but not having the courage to admit that outside, and then alienating themselves from the social world, which creates another issue. And so it's about going through the different layers. It's about taking them where they are in their time and asking more questions than telling them what I think they should do, but then presenting them with options in terms of what they're telling me. Well, if you're telling me this and it leads to that, is that really what you're looking for? But then if you switch it to that and it leads to that, is that what you're looking for? And so depending upon what they're giving me, then I've got to adjust. And the real goal is just to have them at peace with themselves to the degree that they can think about where they are and where they want to go. And then if the questions become more particularly karma-based, well, I'm doing this and I don't know why I'm doing this. And I've heard someone say that, maybe I've done something in a different life. That opens up a whole different conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So it depends really, because again, in that profession, number one, I've got a license. And none of this is considered to be proper, double-blind, crossover, studied, researched, outcome-driven conversation therapy. And yet they are introducing these ideas, meditation, contemplation, self-reflection, that are theosophically driven into modern psychiatry and psychology today. So the question is then using those as techniques to uncover or to contract. There are some people that are just too open and they get blown in the wind everywhere they go. So they can't be open, they need to be closed.
Mm-hmm.
There are some that are too closed, and that closedness is killing them, it's choking them metaphorically, and they need to be opened. And there are those that hate themselves and they want to kill themselves. And then I try to jestfully say, if you can show me yourself, I will help you kill yourself. But if you can't show me yourself, I can't help you kill yourself, because we don't know who your really self is. And if you don't, then to destroy that would be really a tragedy, because that might not solve your problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are just so many different ways in earnest to open up the dialogue, to create the rapport. And then at the heart of that is the fact that, metaphorically, everyone is a spiritual sun. That sun is impersonal. It's caught in a karmic body. And that body is either at peace or it's suffering, or it's sick and it needs healing. And so whatever it needs to create that harmony and that balance is simply what we try to do. One step at a time.
Thank you.
And, I in my own mind, I keep in mind that for me, there is no reality in the conventional sense, because everybody lives in their own head. And in their head, they've created their own reality. It has nothing to do with mine and my point of view. As my wife tells me very often, not everybody thinks everybody needs what you think they need. You know, when we go shopping or whatever, it's like, why are they buying that? Why? Just because you wouldn't buy it doesn't mean they wouldn't buy it, especially when we're talking about fashion. So I've learned my lesson, you know, that, yeah, not everybody needs this degree of stuff. And whatever it is they need, wherever they are at, that's what my job is to serve them at that level, to get them to a point where they're comfortable. And asking then deeper questions, perhaps.
Thank
Well,
you so much.
we're kind of past our time. Would you take a question from Judy?
Sure, sure.
Oh, just very quickly then, Gene, where are we as the human race going with this? I mean, HPV is said to be an androgen, that she really wasn't a woman in the ordinary sense, and examined by a doctor. She couldn't have even had intercourse, let alone have a child. She had evolved to a higher state. I mean, she was an adept. And yet, of course, Judge was married and had a daughter who unfortunately died. So is there a point in which in our evolution toward being masters or not having the same problems that we do, that we're all going to be giving up a sexuality as we now know it, and the human race will have a different form of reproduction?
The short answer is that HPV tells us that, again, 7 phases of sexual reproductive processes do we go through. But the one thing that I try to keep in mind for myself is the monastic being that we are, that lights up the form that we use, is neither androgynous, hermaphroditic, or hetero, homo, bi, whatever. As the statement from HPB's teachers said, occultism is not about sexuality. And so when we're looking into the truth of that monadic entity, the essence and the force, and we're looking at what true androgynism is, and we're looking at what the freedom of true understanding gives us, allowing us to use a male body, a female body, or whatever body we need to use in order to impact the community that we're working with for a particular time. That's what we use. The real elements are about those monads that are at the level of near human awakening, that we are using as vehicles in terms of our sheaths, all of them. Not only the physical, and the question of whether or not we are helping them as we are helping that outside community. So as the teachers say again, it's not the sexual form or organs or any of that. When we're looking at the inner side of those forces that are, you know, very glibly spoken about nowadays as, you know, the channels and Ida and Pingala and the winds and all of that, we're looking at something totally different as it relates to that monadic entity from the occult side, as she tells us even in ESD when she talks about those very same topics. And so the body for me is, again, it's a shell. The real being is not that body. And yet, you know, we know, just as they say Judge did and HPB did, and the teachers themselves spoke about the fact that it's hard to train or retrain a body that you're stepping into to use at a particular time for a particular task. And they speak about that in terms of the vulgar Tibetan terminology that have been printed in the public works as transference of thought or forceful projection of consciousness, or transfer of consciousness. And so the general ideas are there, but the science that goes behind that, as it relates to that deeper science of immortality that the teachers tell us is the only goal in order to help others, is something, again, independent of particular form sexuality as it relates to a body or a sheath.
Well, gosh, Gene, thank you very, very much. I know we could go on for hours. We really could, totally. I don't know. But you've just done a masterful job of providing a real education. And I just wanted to show you guys, first of all, I want to say two things. One is, to me, this whole thing is the structure of unconditionality, which is actually our talk for next week. It's the structure of nonviolence to our fellow brothers and sisters, really, in terms of what so many people are going through. And I think that everybody here either has somebody in their family or knows somebody or whatever who is going through these LGBTQ issues, and has been the case for hundreds of years, except for now that people are actually talking about it, right? And at the same time, mysteriously, I won't use that word mysteriously because you don't like that word, but HPV has arrived on the scene and has given us so much food for thought, and for just the basis of helping each other care for one another in a non-judgmental kind of a way.
Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you all very much for coming and for your support. And thank you above all, Dr. Jennings. Really appreciate it.
No, thank HPB and her teachers. We
No.
just mouth it.
All right.
Right.
Okay.
So great, Gene.
Namaste.
Alrighty.
Hello.
Take care.
Namaste. Everybody be well and safe. Take care.